in the forgotten corners of medieval Europe, where snowdrifts buried secrets and compassion glowed like candlelight through frost-covered windows, there lived communities that history tried to erase, but their humanity could never be extinguished. Hello, friends, and welcome to tonight's journey through time. As you settle into your comfortable space, letting the weight of the day drift away like autumn leaves on a quiet stream, I invite you to travel with me to a world both distant and strangely familiar. Close your eyes if you wish, or let them rest softly on these words as we venture together into the past, into a time when winter brought not just cold, but a particular kind of isolation that transformed into something unexpected, something that speaks to the resilience of the human spirit in ways that might surprise you. Tonight, we're going to explore a chapter of history that many would rather forget, but within its shadows, we'll discover warmth, dignity, and the quiet heroism of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. This is a story about leper colonies during the medieval winter months, but more than that, it's a story about what it means to remain human when the world says you are something less, about finding community in exile, and about the small acts of kindness that can bloom even in the harshest frost. Let me take you back through the centuries, to a time before our modern world, to the years between roughly 1100 and 1400, when Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms and feudal lands, when the church bells marked the rhythm of daily life, and when a diagnosis of leprosy, what we now know as Hansen's disease, meant a kind of death before dying, a separation from everything and everyone you had ever known. Picture, if you will, a small village in what might be northern France or perhaps the lowlands of England, sometime in the early 1300s. It's late November, and the first serious snow of the season has begun to fall, not the gentle decorative flurries that dust the landscape like powdered sugar, but the heavy, determined snow that speaks of a winter that will dig in its heels and stay for months. The village itself is typical of its time, perhaps 40 or 50 families clustered around a stone church with a modest steeple, their homes built of wattle and daub with thatched roofs that smoke from central hearths, narrow dirt paths between buildings that will soon become corridors of packed snow and ice. And beyond the village proper, the fields lying dormant and brown, waiting for spring that feels impossibly distant. But our story doesn't begin in the village center, where the blacksmith is closing up his forge, and the baker's wife is bringing in the last of the loaves before the snow accumulates too heavily. Instead, we must walk, slowly, carefully, with respect, beyond the village boundaries, past the cultivated fields, past even the common grazing lands, to a place that most villagers prefer not to think about, though they know it's there, hovering at the edge of their consciousness like a difficult truth they've learned to live with. Here, about a mile and a half from the village proper, separated by distance and by law, sits the leper colony, though to call it a colony might give you the wrong impression. This is not a grand establishment, not one of the larger leprosaria that existed in some cities, with their chapels and their rules and their formal structures. No, this is something more modest and more precarious, a collection of perhaps 7 small huts, each barely large enough to stand up in, arranged in a rough semicircle around a central clearing, where a fire pit sits cold and dark in the growing darkness of the late afternoon. The huts themselves are crude constructions, built by the inhabitants with whatever materials they could gather or that were grudgingly provided by the parish. Rough timber, bundles of reeds, chunks of turf and prayers, lots of prayers, though whether those prayers were for healing or simply for the strength to endure another day, well, that depended on who was doing the praying. In the largest of these huts, which serves as a kind of communal gathering space when the weather permits, there lives a woman named Marjorie. She's perhaps 40 years old, though the hardship of her life makes it difficult to say with certainty. She could be younger, she could be older. Her face bears the telltale marks of her disease, the skin thickened and nodular in places, one eye clouded, her hands gnarled and missing 2 fingers, not from the disease itself, but from the numbness it causes, the inability to feel when flesh is being burned or cut or damaged. She wraps these damaged hands carefully in strips of wool cloth that she changes regularly, one of the many small rituals of self-care that have become sacred to her, a way of maintaining dignity in a world that would strip it away. Marjorie has been here at this remote settlement for nearly 8 years now, and in that time she has become something of an unofficial leader, not because she sought such a role, but because someone needed to organize the practical matters of survival, and she happened to have the combination of clear-headedness, determination, and compassion that such a position requires. Before the diagnosis, before the examination by the village priest and the 2 traveling monks who happened to be passing through, and who confirmed what everyone had begun to suspect, Marjorie had been the wife of a carpenter, the mother of 3 children who were now being raised by her sister, and a woman known for her skill at dyeing wool in particularly vibrant shades of yellow and green, using plants she gathered from the forest margins. That life feels to her now like something she once dreamed, or perhaps something she once read about in a story, if she could read, which she cannot. The separation had been brutal in its swiftness, as such separations always were. 1 week she was living in her home, sleeping beside her husband, kissing her children's foreheads each night, and the next week she was being led out of the village in a solemn procession that felt like a funeral, because in many ways that's exactly what it was, the funeral of her former life. They had performed the ritual, the one prescribed by the church for such occasions, where the priest threw 3 shovelfuls of earth onto her while she stood in an empty grave, symbolizing her death to the world she knew. And then they had given her the items she was permitted to take: a clapper, a wooden rattle that she was required to sound whenever she approached public roads or places where healthy people might be, to warn them of her presence, a special gray or dark cloak that marked her status, a begging bowl attached to a long stick so that any alms could be placed in it without the giver coming too close, and a small sack of her personal possessions, though there wasn't much to pack, just a spare shift, a blanket, a comb that had belonged to her mother, and a small wooden cross that her youngest daughter had pressed into her hand during the tearful goodbye that had been cut short because people feared that prolonged contact, especially emotional contact that might involve tears touching skin, could spread the contagion. Now, on this late November afternoon, as the snow begins to fall in earnest, Marjorie stands in the doorway of her hut, watching the white flakes drift down from a sky the color of old pewter. She has learned in her years here to read the quality of snow, to distinguish between the light snows that will melt by midday and the heavy snows that signal the beginning of winter's true grip. And this snow, with its large, wet flakes and the particular smell in the air, a clean, almost metallic scent, tells her that they are in for a serious accumulation, perhaps the first of several storms that will follow in quick succession. This knowledge brings with it a complex mixture of emotions that she has also learned to recognize and accept. There is anxiety, certainly, because winter is the hardest time for those living at the margins, when food becomes scarce and cold becomes an enemy that must be fought every hour of every day. But there is also a strange kind of relief, because winter means that the distance between the colony and the village becomes even greater, not just in miles but in attention. And for months at a time, they are likely to be left almost entirely alone, without the occasional visitors who come during warmer weather, the priests performing their obligatory but perfunctory spiritual duties, the village boys who sometimes throw stones from a safe distance, the curious travelers who stare at them as if they were animals in a menagerie, the occasional official checking to make sure they haven't violated any of the countless restrictions placed upon them. In winter, the snow becomes a kind of blanket that covers them not just physically but socially. And in that isolation, there is a paradoxical freedom, a space where they can simply be themselves, where Marjorie can be Marjorie and not the leper woman, where her companions can be people with names and histories and preferences and quirks, rather than simply diseased bodies to be pitied and feared. She pulls her cloak tighter around her shoulders. It's a better cloak than the one she was given at her separation. This one she made herself from wool she traded for during the previous summer when a traveling merchant, more compassionate than most, had agreed to leave materials at the edge of the clearing in exchange for a small carving that Thomas, one of her fellow inhabitants, had made, and she turns back into the dim interior of the hut, where a small fire burns in a ring of stones. The fire is one of their most precious resources, kept alive through the night by whoever is on watch, fed carefully with wood that they gather throughout the warmer months and stack against the north wall of each hut, calculating anxiously whether they have enough to last until spring, knowing that running out would mean choosing between freezing and risking a dangerous journey to the forest to gather more, and also knowing that such a journey would likely be noticed and might bring punishment. Because lepers were forbidden from entering the woods without special permission, forbidden from so many things that keeping track of all the prohibitions was itself exhausting. Sitting by this fire is Thomas, the man who carved the figure that bought the wool, and beside him, wrapped in a blanket that has been patched so many times it's more patched than original fabric, is a younger man named John, though everyone calls him John the Quiet, to distinguish him from another John who lived here until his death 2 winters ago. John the Quiet is perhaps 25 years old, and he has been at the colony for only 6 months, still adjusting to this new life, still prone to long silences during which his eyes go distant and sad as he presumably thinks about the life he left behind, the sweetheart he had been courting, the plans they had been making, All of it dissolved in the span of a few horrible weeks when the numbness in his hands began, when the patches on his skin appeared. When the diagnosis was pronounced with the finality of a death sentence. Marjorie has seen this pattern before, this initial period of grief and disorientation that every newcomer goes through, and she has learned to give people space for their sorrow while also gently, persistently, drawing them into the rhythms and routines of the community. Because survival here requires participation, requires everyone to contribute what they can when they can, and also because she has discovered that staying busy, having purpose, having small tasks and responsibilities, these things are as necessary as food and shelter, maybe more so, because it's possible to endure physical hardship if your spirit remains intact. But when the spirit breaks, when a person gives up and turns their face to the wall, well, that's when death comes quickly and not always gently. Storms settling in, Marjorie says as she enters, her voice carrying that particular quality of someone who has learned to speak clearly despite the physical changes the disease has brought to her mouth and throat. And both men look up, Thomas nodding in acknowledgement, John simply blinking slowly, still not quite fully present in the moment. We should check on the others before it gets too heavy to move about easily, she continues, settling herself onto the low bench that runs along one wall, a bench that Thomas built last spring during a period when his hands were having a good spell, when the stiffness and pain had eased enough for him to work with tools, though he had paid for that productivity with several days of agony afterward, his knuckles swelling until his fingers looked like misshapen roots. Thomas is older than Marjorie, perhaps in his middle 50s, a man who had been a shepherd before his diagnosis, who had spent his life in the hills watching over flocks, sleeping under stars, living with a solitude that perhaps prepared him better than most for the isolation of this place. He had lost his nose to the disease, and he wears a cloth wrapping around the lower part of his face both for practical reasons, to keep the cold air from the exposed cavity, and because he knows that his appearance disturbs people, even here, even among fellow sufferers, and he possesses a natural courtesy that makes him want to spare others discomfort. Marie was coughing badly last night, Thomas says, his voice muffled by the wrapping but still intelligible to those who have learned to listen. I could hear it from my hut. That deep, wet cough that settles in the chest. There's worry in his tone, and rightfully so, because winter illnesses are particularly dangerous for people in their condition, their bodies already compromised, their ability to fight off infections diminished, and access to medical care, such as it was in medieval Europe, absolutely non-existent for people like them. Marie is an elderly woman, perhaps 60 years old, one of the oldest in their small community, and she has been declining steadily over the past year, her body growing thinner, her strength ebbing, though her spirit remains fierce and surprisingly cheerful, as if she has made her peace with whatever is coming and decided to enjoy whatever time remains to her. She lives alone in the smallest hut, the one closest to the forest edge, and she insists on maintaining her independence even though Marjorie has several times suggested that she might move in with one of the others, that it would be safer, warmer, easier to keep an eye on her health. But Marie refuses with a gentle stubbornness that Marjorie has come to respect, understanding that when so much has been taken from you, the ability to make even small choices about how you live becomes precious beyond measure. "I'll go to her after we eat," Marjorie says, because there is always this balance to maintain between taking care of others and taking care of oneself. And she knows that she's no good to anyone if she doesn't maintain her own strength. "John, are you able to help me carry some extra firewood to her hut? She'll need more than usual if she's fighting off an illness." John the Quiet looks up at the sound of his name, and for a moment Marjorie can see him wrestling with his own exhaustion, his own sadness. But then something shifts in his expression and he nods, a small nod but definite, and Marjorie feels a quiet satisfaction because this is progress. This is engagement. This is what she's been hoping to see. Signs that he's beginning to accept his situation not with resignation, but with something more active. A decision to live as fully as possible within the constraints that have been imposed upon him. The food they eat that evening is simple but adequate. A pottage made from dried peas and barley, with some wild onions that Marjorie had gathered before the ground froze, seasoned with a precious pinch of salt from the small store they maintain, salt that was gifted to them by the parish, along with a monthly allocation of grain. These grudging provisions offered not out of generosity, but out of religious obligation. The church's teaching that even the diseased and outcast were God's children and must not be allowed to simply starve. Though there was considerable debate about exactly how much support was required to fulfill this obligation, with most authorities settling on the bare minimum necessary to sustain life. They eat from wooden bowls that Thomas carved during his productive spring, using spoons they've fashioned from horn and wood, sitting close to the fire because the heat radiating from even this small flame is precious. And they eat slowly, partly because their damaged mouths and throats sometimes make swallowing difficult, and partly because meals are social times, opportunities for conversation and connection, for the sharing not just of food, but of thoughts and memories and observations. Tonight, as the snow continues to fall outside, making a soft, shushing sound as it accumulates on the roof thatch, Thomas tells a story about a lamb he once raised, a creature that had been rejected by its mother, and that he had fed by hand, carrying it inside his shepherd's hut during cold nights, watching it grow from a weak, wobbling thing into a strong young sheep that followed him everywhere like a devoted dog. He tells the story with a kind of gentle nostalgia, not with bitterness about the life he's lost, but with genuine pleasure in the memory itself, in the act of remembering. And as he speaks, Marjorie watches John's face and sees him listening, really listening, his expression softening, the tense lines around his mouth easing slightly. And she thinks that maybe, just maybe, he's beginning to understand what they've all learned here. That you can't go back. You can't reclaim what was taken. But you can find moments of beauty and meaning in the present if you're willing to look for them, if you're willing to be open to them. After the meal, true to her word, Marjorie bundles herself in her cloak and helps John gather an armload of firewood each, pieces they've kept especially dry under a leather covering, and together they make their way through the snow to Marie's hut. The snow is already several inches deep and still falling steadily, and in the gathering darkness it creates an eerie beauty, the the white ground seeming to glow with its own soft light, the familiar landscape transformed into something strange and otherworldly. Marjorie has made this walk countless times, knows every root and rock that might trip an unwary foot, but tonight she moves more carefully than usual, both because of the snow and because she's watching John, making sure he's managing all right. And she notices that he moves well, his younger body still strong despite the disease, his balance good, and she makes a mental note that he might be well suited for some of the tasks that require mobility and strength, gathering wood from farther afield, perhaps helping to repair the huts when spring comes, tasks that will give him purpose and keep his body active and his mind engaged. When they reach Marie's hut, Marjorie calls out softly before pushing aside the leather flap that serves as a door, because even here, especially here, privacy and dignity matter. The courtesy of announcing your presence, of not barging in, of treating each other with the respect that the outside world withholds. Inside, Marie is huddled near her small fire, and indeed Marjorie can hear the cough that Thomas mentioned, a deep, rattling sound that seems to shake Marie's entire frame. The elderly woman looks up as they enter, and despite her obvious discomfort, her face breaks into a smile that crinkles the diseased skin around her eyes into a map of wrinkles and folds. "Such service," she says in her raspy voice. "Visitors and firewood, I'm quite spoiled tonight." Her humor, undiminished even in illness, even in discomfort, makes Marjorie's chest tighten with affection, and she crosses the small space to kneel beside Marie, placing a careful hand on her shoulder, feeling the bird-like fragility of her bones beneath the layers of clothing. "You sound terrible," Marjorie says bluntly, because there's no point in pretending otherwise. "How long have you been coughing like this?" Marie waves a dismissive hand, or tries to, the gesture interrupted by another coughing fit that leaves her breathless and gasping. When she can speak again, she says, "Started yesterday morning, came on suddenly like. Probably just the cold settling in, nothing to fuss over." But Marjorie can see the flush on Marie's cheeks that might be fever, can feel the heat radiating from her skin even through the layers of clothing, and she knows that this is more than just a simple chill. This is potentially serious, and the worry that's been gnawing at her since Thomas mentioned the coughing intensifies into something closer to fear, because they have lost people to winter illnesses before, people who seemed fine one week and were gone the next. Their damaged bodies unable to mount an effective defense against infections that a healthy person might shake off with relative ease. While John stacks the firewood they've brought in a neat pile near Marie's fire, Marjorie questions the older woman more closely, asking about her appetite, her sleep, whether she's drinking enough water, whether she's been keeping warm enough. And Marie answers patiently, truthfully, admitting that yes, she's had little appetite for the past few days, that her sleep has been fitful, interrupted by coughing and by a soreness in her chest that worsens when she breathes deeply. Marjorie's mind races through the limited options available to them, thinking about the dried herbs they have stored away, some feverfew that might help with the fever, some mullein for the cough, some yarrow for its general healing properties, all of them gathered during the summer and fall by whoever had the energy and mobility to forage, then carefully dried and stored in leather pouches against the inevitable needs of winter. She also thinks about the honey they have, a precious small jar that someone, whether from guilty conscience or genuine charity they'll never know, left at the edge of their clearing one morning. And honey is gold for treating coughs and sore throats, its sweetness soothing and its natural properties genuinely helpful, though they've been rationing it carefully, knowing that once it's gone there will be no more until summer at the earliest. "I'm going to make you something to drink," Marjorie decides, speaking with the firm tone she uses when she expects to be obeyed. "Hot water with honey and some herbs, and you're going to drink all of it, every drop. John will stay with you while I fetch what's needed and get water heated." Marie starts to protest, saying she doesn't want to be a burden, that she's fine, really, but Marjorie cuts her off with a look that contains equal parts sternness and affection. "We take care of each other here," she says, and it's a statement of fact, the foundational principle of their little community, the thing that makes survival possible both physically and spiritually. This commitment to mutual care in the face of a world that offers them neither care nor regard. John, who has finished stacking the wood and has been standing somewhat awkwardly by the entrance, uncertain of his role in this situation, straightens at Marjorie's words and nods. "I can stay," he says quietly, and it's perhaps the first time since his arrival that he's volunteered to do something without being asked. The first sign that he's beginning to see himself as part of the community, rather than simply a prisoner of circumstance who happens to be housed in the same location as others. Marjorie hurries back to the main hut through snow that is now falling so thickly she can barely see more than a few feet ahead, the flakes catching in her eyelashes and on the wool of her cloak, the world reduced to a swirling white darkness that would be beautiful if she had leisure to appreciate it. But right now her mind is focused entirely on Marie, on gathering what's needed, on doing what can be done, which isn't much but isn't nothing either, and that distinction matters. That sliver of agency in a situation otherwise defined by powerlessness. In the main hut, she finds Thomas feeding more wood to the fire, building it up because he too has sensed the serious nature of this storm, the need to maintain warmth through what might be a long, cold night. She explains the situation with Marie in quick, efficient words, and Thomas immediately offers to help, asking what he can carry, what he can do, and together they assemble what's needed. The leather pouch with the feverfew and mullein, the small clay jar with the honey, Marjorie's own cup because Marie's is cracked and might leak, and clean cloth strips in case they're needed for compresses or for Marie to cough into. Thomas also suggests something else, something that shows the kind of creative problem-solving that survival in their circumstances demands. "The stone by my fire pit," he says, "the large flat one. We could heat it until it's properly hot, wrap it in cloth, and place it at Marie's feet or against her back. The warmth would help, might even help her sleep. It's a good idea, a clever use of available resources, and Marjorie agrees immediately. So Thomas uses the carved wooden tongs he fashioned for handling hot items to place the stone directly in the fire, positioning it where the flames are hottest, where it will absorb the maximum heat. While they wait for the water to boil in the small iron pot that is one of their most valuable possessions, a relic from someone's previous life. Its ownership history lost to time, but its utility unquestionable. Marjorie and Thomas talk quietly about Marie, about their concern for her, about the other members of their small community, and how they're faring as winter settles in properly. There's William, who lives in the hut farthest from the center, a man who keeps mostly to himself but who is reliable and steady, who does his share of work without complaint but seems to carry a deep well of sadness that he never speaks about, and who Marjorie worries about in a different way, not for his physical health but for the state of his spirit, for what happens inside a person who holds everything in, who never shares the burden of their grief. There's also young Anne, barely 18, who has been with them for about a year, and whose situation is particularly tragic because she was diagnosed just months before her planned wedding, the disease revealing itself with cruel timing, transforming what should have been the happiest period of her life into a nightmare of loss and exile. Anne has struggled, has had periods of deep despair where she wouldn't leave her hut for days at a time, wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak, and Marjorie has spent many hours sitting with her, not always talking, sometimes just sitting in companionable silence, being present, showing through her presence that Anne is not alone, that she is seen and valued, that her pain is acknowledged even if it can't be fixed. Lately, Anne has been doing better, has been emerging more often, has even smiled occasionally, and Marjorie takes hope from these small signs of healing, though she knows that grief and adjustment are not linear processes, that there will be setbacks and difficult days ahead, and that all she can do is continue to offer support, continue to create a space where it's safe to be sad but also safe to start living again. And there's Peter, the seventh member of their community, a man in his 30s who was a stone mason before his diagnosis, and who still has remarkable strength in his damaged hands, a fact that seems almost miraculous but which he explains by saying that he worked with stone his whole life, his hands becoming so calloused and strong that even the disease can't completely undo what decades of labor built. Peter is practical and resourceful, the one who has done most of the work improving their huts, adding supports, patching holes, figuring out how to channel rain away from their living spaces, and Marjorie relies on him heavily for the physical work that her own declining strength makes difficult. The water finally boils, steam rising from the pot in visible clouds, and Marjorie carefully measures out the herbs, crumbling the dried leaves between her fingers, releasing their dusty, slightly bitter smell into the humid air, then adding a generous spoonful of honey, watching it dissolve into the hot water, turning the liquid golden and sweet. She pours this mixture into the cup, wraps the cup in a piece of cloth so she can carry it without burning her hands, and Thomas, using his tongs, retrieves the now hot stone from the fire, wrapping it in multiple layers of cloth until it's safe to handle while still retaining its heat. Together, they make their way back to Marie's hut, moving slowly because the snow is even deeper now, and because they're carrying precious cargo that mustn't be dropped or spilled. When they push aside the leather door flap, they find John sitting cross-legged on the floor near Marie, and he appears to be talking to her, his quiet voice just audible, telling her something, and Marie is listening with her eyes closed, a slight smile on her cracked lips, and Marjorie feels a surge of warmth toward this young man who is finding his way, who is learning that even in this place, especially in this place, human connection matters, that we are more than our diseased bodies, that we remain people with the capacity to comfort and be comforted, to care and be cared for. The intrusion of Marjorie and Thomas breaks the quiet moment, and John trails off, looking slightly embarrassed. But Marie opens her eyes and reaches out a gnarled hand toward him, touching his arm briefly in a gesture of thanks. Marjorie kneels beside Marie again and hands her the cup, supporting it because Marie's hands shake, helping her bring it to her lips, waiting while she sips cautiously because the liquid is still very hot. "Drink slowly," Marjorie instructs. "Let it cool a bit if it's too hot, but try to drink as much as you can." Marie obeys, taking small sips, and after a few swallows she pauses, looking at Marjorie with eyes that are roomy but still sharp with intelligence and awareness. "You're a good soul, Marjorie," she says softly, "taking care of us like you do. Don't know what we'd do without you." Marjorie feels her throat tighten with emotion, unused to direct expressions of gratitude, uncomfortable with praise because she doesn't see what she does as anything special, just as what needs doing, but she manages to murmur, "We take care of each other, that's all. That's what we do," repeating that fundamental principle because it bears repeating, because it's the truth that sustains them. Thomas has unwrapped the hot stone and placed it at Marie's feet, positioning it carefully so she can warm herself without burning herself. And the heat rising from it is palpable even from where Marjorie kneels, a small but significant source of comfort in the cold hut. They stay with Marie for perhaps another hour, making sure she finishes the medicinal drink, making sure she's as comfortable as possible, banking her fire so it will burn steadily through the night. And when they finally leave, stepping back out into the storm that shows no signs of abating, Marjorie takes John's arm to steady herself in the deep snow, and she can feel the strength in his young body, and she thinks about how they all need each other in different ways, how her experience and organizational skills, Thomas's practical wisdom and gentle kindness, Peter's physical strength and building skills, Anne's gradual healing and growing resilience, William's quiet reliability, Marie's humor and perspective, and John's youth and strength, how all of these different attributes and capabilities weave together to create something larger than any individual could manage alone. A fragile but real community built on mutual dependence and shared humanity. Back in the main hut, the three of them shake off the snow that has accumulated on their cloaks and hair, stamping their feet to restore circulation, drawing close to the fire that Thomas had built up before they left, and that is still burning strongly, filling the small space with welcome warmth and flickering orange light. The storm outside has intensified even further, the wind picking up so that they can hear it howling around the corners of the hut, finding every gap in the construction, every imperfect seal, sending little drafts of cold air whistling through cracks that will need to be packed with moss or cloth when morning comes, if the storm has passed by then. Marjorie settles onto the bench with a sigh that comes from deep in her bones, the kind of tiredness that isn't just physical but encompasses mental and emotional exhaustion as well, the weight of responsibility, the constant low-level anxiety about whether they have enough of everything, whether everyone will survive the winter, whether she's making the right decisions, doing enough, doing too much, striking the proper balance between protecting people and allowing them their autonomy and dignity. Thomas adds another piece of wood to the fire, selecting it carefully from their stack, always conscious of the need to make their supply last, to burn efficiently, to waste nothing. And then he settles himself on the floor near the fire, his usual spot, where he can lean back against the wall and stretch out his legs, easing the stiffness that never entirely leaves his joints anymore. John remains standing for a moment, uncertain, still learning the rhythms and routines of this household, still figuring out where he fits. And then he moves to sit on the far end of the bench from Marjorie, maintaining a respectful distance. And for a while the three of them simply sit in silence, listening to the storm, watching the flames dance and flicker, each absorbed in their own thoughts. And this silence is comfortable, companionable. The kind of silence that can exist between people who have learned to be at ease in each other's presence without the need for constant conversation. Eventually, Thomas breaks the silence, speaking in his muffled but gentle voice. "Storm like this, I remember being out in the hills with the sheep, how you could see it coming from miles away, this wall of white moving across the land, and you'd have to hurry to get the flock into whatever shelter you could find, a stand of trees, a rock outcropping, sometimes just a dip in the ground that would give a bit of protection from the wind." He pauses, staring into the fire, and Marjorie knows he's seeing it in his mind, that landscape of his past, those hills and flocks that were his whole world for so many years. The sheep, they'd huddle together for warmth, and I'd hunker down among them, and their wool and their bodies would keep me from freezing even in the worst weather. Funny thing about sheep, people think they're stupid, and in some ways they are, but they understand huddling, understand that together they're warmer, safer, that the ones on the outside of the huddle take the brunt of the wind and cold, so the ones in the middle can be warm. And then they'd shift and rotate so everyone got time in the warm center, and everyone took their turn facing the cold. The story hangs in the air, and Marjorie understands that Thomas isn't just reminiscing. He's offering them a parable, a way of thinking about their own situation, about how they too huddle together against the storms, both literal and metaphorical, about how they take turns being strong when others are weak, about how survival requires both community and sacrifice. John seems to be considering the story as well, his brow furrowed in thought, and after a moment he speaks, his voice still quiet but more present than it has been, more engaged. "My father kept pigs," he says, and it's the first time he's voluntarily shared anything about his previous life, the first crack in the shell of silence he's built around his past. "Not many, just 3 or 4 at a time, and I hated those pigs when I was a boy. Hated having to feed them and muck out their pens, hated the smell and the noise, and used to complain bitterly about it." He pauses, and a small, sad smile crosses his face. "Now I'd give anything to be back in that pig pen, covered in mud and manure, complaining about the smell. Funny what you miss, what you took for granted." Marjorie nods, understanding this sentiment deeply, because she too has found herself longing for things she once considered tedious or unpleasant, The ordinary aggravations of normal life that seemed like burdens at the time, but which she would embrace gratefully now if only she could have her old life back. Her children's quarrels and demands, her husband's habits that sometimes irritated her, the endless work of maintaining a household, cooking and cleaning and mending, all of it precious in retrospect. All of it part of a life that felt secure and normal and hers. "I miss the smell of my children's hair," she says softly, speaking into the fire rather than looking at her companions, because some admissions are easier made to flames than to faces. "After I'd washed it, that clean smell like sun and herbs and something else, something that was just them, that particular scent that each of them had. My youngest, she had the softest hair like silk, and she'd let me comb it for hours while I told her stories, and she'd sit so still and patient, just enjoying being cared for." The memory is sharp enough to hurt, and Marjorie feels tears prick at her eyes, but she doesn't wipe them away, doesn't try to hide them, because tears too are allowed here, grief is acknowledged here. They don't pretend that everything is fine when it isn't, don't put on false cheer or denial, but rather allow space for the full range of human emotion, the sorrow and the joy, the regret and the acceptance, the pain and the small pleasures that punctuate their days. Thomas shifts, the leather wrapping around his face rustling slightly, and when he speaks his voice is rougher than usual, thick with emotion. "I miss solitude," he says, which might sound strange coming from a man living in isolation, but Marjorie understands what he means. Not this kind of solitude, not being cast out, but the solitude I chose, the hours I spent alone in the hills because I wanted to be there, because I loved the quiet and the space and the sky. That was freedom, that aloneness. This, and he gestures vaguely at their surroundings, this is isolation, which is a different thing entirely. You can be alone without being lonely, and you can be with others and still feel cut off from the world. The difference is choice, I think. I chose my solitude then. I don't choose this now. His words articulate something that Marjorie has felt but never quite put into language. This distinction between solitude and isolation, between chosen withdrawal and enforced exile. And she finds herself nodding vigorously, grateful for his clarity, grateful for this conversation that is happening naturally, organically, without anyone forcing it. Just three people sharing their thoughts and feelings on a winter night while a storm rages outside. The conversation continues like this for some time, meandering from topic to topic in the way that good conversations do, following no particular agenda but creating connection through the simple act of sharing, of being heard, of hearing others. They talk about food they miss, particular dishes that their mothers or wives made, flavors and textures that exist now only in memory. John describes a meat pie his mother made with venison and mushrooms and a crust that was somehow both flaky and substantial. Marjorie recalls a honey cake she used to make for feast days, and Thomas grows almost poetic describing fresh milk, still warm from the cow, drunk at dawn on cold mornings. They talk about seasons, about spring especially, which feels impossibly distant right now, but which they agree is the best time of year, when the world comes back to life, and their own lives become slightly easier, when foraging becomes possible again, and the tight anxiety about food stores eases somewhat. They talk about small things they've noticed. The way icicles form on the edge of Thomas's hut in particular patterns. The family of mice that has apparently taken up residence in the thatch of Anne's roof. The fox that Marjorie saw several days ago, its red fur bright against the snow, watching them from the tree line with intelligent amber eyes. As the night deepens and the fire burns lower, requiring more fuel which Thomas adds with his usual care, their conversation eventually winds down into comfortable silence again, and Marjorie finds herself feeling something that might almost be contentment, or if not contentment exactly, then at least a kind of peace, a temporary respite from worry and sorrow, a moment of human warmth and connection that makes the cold and isolation feel less absolute, less overwhelming. These moments, she has learned, are precious and should be recognized as such, should be held gently in the mind, stored away like the wood they stack for winter, fuel for the soul that can be drawn upon during darker times, during the moments of despair and hopelessness that inevitably come, and that must be weathered just as surely as they weather the physical storms. She looks at Thomas, at his rapt face and his damaged hands folded peacefully in his lap, at his posture of quiet strength and acceptance, and she feels deep gratitude for his presence, for his wisdom and steadiness. She looks at John, at his young face still marked by sadness but showing signs of engagement, of connection, of tentative belonging, and she feels hope that he will find his way through this, that he will become fully part of their community, that the worst of his grief will eventually ease into something he can carry without being crushed by it. Eventually, because even peaceful moments must end and practical concerns reassert themselves, Marjorie stirs herself to address the question of sleeping arrangements for the night. Normally, John sleeps in a hut with Peter, the two of them sharing the space and the warmth, each maintaining their own small fire but benefiting from the additional body heat that two people in one space provide. But tonight, with the storm so intense and still raging, Marjorie makes a decision. "John, you should stay here tonight," she says, speaking with the authority of someone used to making such decisions and having them accepted. "No point in you trying to navigate to Peter's hut in this weather, and we have room enough here. You can sleep by the fire, and Thomas and I will take our usual spots." Her own sleeping area is a sort of alcove she's created using hanging blankets, a small private space in one corner of the hut where she can retreat, and Thomas sleeps in another corner, each of them with their own piles of straw covered with whatever cloth and blankets they've been able to accumulate, humble beds but adequate, and more importantly, dry and reasonably warm when the fire is maintained properly throughout the night. John accepts this arrangement without protest, perhaps because he's too tired to argue, perhaps because he's secretly relieved not to have to venture out into the storm again, and Marjorie sets about preparing the space for him, gathering some of the spare straw they keep stored in a dry corner, spreading it near the fire pit, but not so close that a spark might set it aflame, covering it with a blanket that's thin but clean, arranging it all with a matter-of-fact efficiency that doesn't make John feel like a burden or a child being fussed over, but rather like a guest being provided for, which is exactly the tone she wants to strike, because dignity, always dignity, the dignity of being treated as a capable adult who happens to need some temporary assistance, not as someone helpless or pitiable. She also makes sure that a cup of water is within his reach, and that he knows where the chamber pot is located, one of the few amenities they have, and even that is just a simple clay pot with a lid that must be emptied each morning, a task they rotate among themselves. Nobody exempt because nobody is too good for such work. Everyone equal in the democracy of necessity. As they settle down for the night, each arranging themselves in their designated spaces, pulling blankets and cloaks around themselves for warmth, Thomas takes the first watch of the night, volunteering to stay awake for several hours to maintain the fire, to make sure it doesn't die down to the point where they'd wake in dangerous cold, and also to listen for any sounds that might indicate problems, whether from the storm causing damage to their structures, or from one of the other inhabitants needing help, or from any of the countless small disasters that can occur when people are living on the edge of survival in harsh conditions. Marjorie, lying in her alcove, can see through the gap in her blanket curtain the glow of the fire and Thomas's silhouette, sitting upright against the wall, keeping his vigil, and she feels safe knowing he's there, feels that she can release her own constant vigilance for a few hours and actually rest, trusting him to watch over them. She can hear John settling into his makeshift bed, hear his breathing gradually slowing and deepening as exhaustion claims him, and she thinks about his youth, about how much life he should have ahead of him, about how unfair it is that disease has stolen his future, or at least the future he had imagined. But then she reminds herself that none of them truly knows what future awaits, that life is uncertain for everyone, and that perhaps there is still possibility for him, still chances for meaning and connection, and even moments of happiness, different than what he had planned, but not necessarily less valuable for being different. Her own sleep, when it comes, is fitful, punctuated by coughing, her own, because she too has felt the tickle in her throat this past day, has noticed the slight ache in her chest that might be the beginning of the same illness that has taken hold of Marie, or might be nothing, might pass. And she tries not to worry about it, tries not to imagine the worst. But in the darkness of night, fears always seem larger, more immediate, more certain. She wakes fully sometime in the deepest part of night to find that the watch has changed. Thomas now sleeping and John sitting by the fire, feeding it carefully, and she watches him for a moment through heavy eyelids, watches how he moves with increasing confidence, how he's learning the skills they all must know, how to judge how much wood to add, how to position it for best burning, how to use the wooden tongs to adjust logs without getting burned. All the small practical knowledge that becomes second nature when you do it day after day, night after night. She wants to tell him that he's doing well, that she's proud of his progress, that she sees his effort and his courage, but her throat is too sore for easy speech, and he seems absorbed in his task. So she simply watches him for a few minutes more before letting sleep reclaim her, drifting back into dreams that are confused and fragmentary, mixing memories of her children with images of the snow falling endlessly, covering everything, transforming the world into something both beautiful and threatening. When morning finally comes, it arrives without fanfare, the darkness gradually, almost imperceptibly, giving way to a dim gray light that seeps in through the cracks and gaps in the hut's construction, and also through the smoke hole in the roof which allows the fire's smoke to escape and fresh air to enter. And by this light, Marjorie can see that the storm has finally passed. The wind has died down, and through the small window opening, just a gap really, covered with oiled leather that can be tied back in good weather, she can see that the sky has cleared, revealing a pale winter sun that provides light but precious little warmth. She pulls herself upright, grimacing at the stiffness in her joints, at the soreness in her chest that has, if anything, intensified overnight, at the headache that pounds behind her eyes. And she knows with a sinking certainty that she is indeed falling ill, that whatever Marie has, she has caught it, or perhaps they both caught it from the same source, or perhaps it doesn't matter how it happened. It matters only that it has happened and now must be dealt with. Thomas is awake. She can tell by the quality of his stillness, and when she emerges from her alcove, wrapping her cloak around herself because the morning air is bitterly cold despite the fire that John has kept burning through the night, Thomas looks at her with concern immediately evident in his eyes, reading in her face and posture the signs of illness that she cannot hide. "You're sick," he says, and it's not a question but a statement, and Marjorie doesn't bother denying it, just nods, then has to suppress a cough that wants to force its way up from her lungs. "I'll be all right," she says, though she's not at all certain this is true, and Thomas makes a small sound that might be skepticism or might be worry, and he begins to say something, probably to insist that she should rest, that he and the others will manage, but Marjorie cuts him off with a raised hand. "Before I do anything else, before I even think about resting, I need to check on Marie. If the night was as hard on her as it was on me, she may need help this morning." Thomas looks like he wants to argue, wants to insist that Marjorie must take care of herself first, but he knows her well enough to recognize when argument is futile, so instead he simply nods and says, "I'll come with you. You shouldn't be navigating that much snow in your condition." John, who has been quietly tending the fire, looks up at this exchange, and Marjorie can see the question forming in his mind, can see him about to offer to go in their place, to check on Marie himself so Marjorie can rest. And it's a kind impulse, a generous impulse, but Marjorie shakes her head before he can speak. "You've been up all night keeping watch," she tells him. "You need to sleep now. Thomas and I will manage." She sees the flicker of disappointment cross his face, the desire to be useful warring with genuine exhaustion, and then he nods, accepting her directive, and she's pleased to see this, pleased that he's learning to pick his battles, to recognize when he needs rest and to take it without false heroics. They leave him to bank the fire and arrange himself for sleep, and Marjorie and Thomas push aside the leather door flap and step out into a world transformed by the night's snowfall. The accumulation is significant, perhaps 2 feet or more in places where the wind has created drifts, and everywhere the snow sparkles in the weak morning sunlight with a million tiny crystals of ice, beautiful in a way that Marjorie would appreciate more if she weren't feeling so wretched, if every breath weren't an effort, if her head weren't pounding, and her body weren't aching. They make their way toward Marie's hut, walking slowly, Thomas breaking trail through the deeper snow, offering Marjorie his arm for support when the going gets particularly difficult, and she's grateful for his presence, grateful for his steady strength, though she's also aware that this walk is difficult for him too, that his damaged feet and legs don't navigate uneven, snow-covered ground easily, that every step requires effort and balance, and probably causes him pain that he doesn't mention because complaining is pointless, because pain is simply part of existence for all of them and must be endured. When they reach Marie's hut, Marjorie calls out softly, announcing their presence, waiting for Marie's response, for the familiar sound of her raspy voice telling them to enter. But there is no response, just silence, and Marjorie feels her heart clench with sudden fear, that awful certainty that sometimes comes before you have actual evidence, the body knowing what the mind doesn't want to accept. She pushes aside the leather flap and steps inside, Thomas right behind her, and in the dim interior, illuminated only by the dying embers of what was Marie's fire, they can see the elderly woman lying on her pallet, very still, too still. And even before she crosses the space and kneels beside Marie, even before she reaches out a trembling hand to touch Marie's cold cheek, Marjorie knows that Marie is gone, that she died sometime during the night, probably in her sleep if they're lucky. Hopefully without pain or fear, just a gradual slipping away into darkness, her worn-out body finally giving up its struggle. Thomas makes a small sound, something between a sigh and a sob, and he too kneels beside Marie's body. And for a moment they both simply sit there, in the cold hut with its dead fire and its dead occupant, and Marjorie feels the weight of grief press down on her, heavy and familiar because this is not the first death she's witnessed here, not the first person she's helped and cared for and come to love who has been taken by illness or injury, or simply the cumulative toll of a disease that gradually destroys the body's ability to function. Marie was old, older than most who end up in places like this, and she had lived longer with leprosy than many do, and by that measure her death could be seen as natural, expected, even merciful in its way, a release from suffering. But none of these rational observations make the grief less sharp, make the loss less real, make the world feel less diminished by her absence. "She was a good woman," Thomas says finally, his voice thick with emotion, and Marjorie nods, unable to speak around the lump in her own throat, and she reaches out to gently close Marie's eyes, to straighten her limbs, to perform these small final services, these gestures of respect and care that the dead can no longer appreciate, but that the living need to offer, need to do as a way of saying this person mattered. This life had value. This death leaves a hole in our small world. They sit with Marie for perhaps a quarter of an hour, neither speaking, both lost in their own memories and thoughts. And then, because life demands that they continue, because the practical necessities of death must be attended to, Marjorie stirs herself to action. "We need to tell the others," she says quietly. "And we need to prepare her for burial, though we can't bury her properly until the ground thaws. We'll have to keep her body preserved somehow, probably in one of the storage areas, packed with snow." This is the grim reality of winter death in their circumstances. Burial is impossible when the ground is frozen solid, and while leaving a body exposed would allow it to freeze naturally, such treatment feels disrespectful. So they will wrap Marie carefully, will place her somewhere cold and protected, will perform whatever rituals they can manage given their resources and restrictions. And then in spring, when the earth softens, they will give her a proper burial. Will mark her resting place with whatever marker they can create. Will speak words over her grave even though no priest will come to offer official blessings, because they are capable of honoring their dead, even if the church would prefer to pretend they don't exist. Thomas agrees with this plan, and together they begin the sad work of preparing Marie's body, washing her gently with water that Thomas fetches and warms over the rebuilt fire, using cloth strips to clean her face and hands, straightening her clothing, wrapping her in the blanket she slept under, and finally in a leather covering that will protect her from animals and the elements. They work in silence mostly, each absorbed in the task, in their memories of Marie, in their own private griefs, though occasionally one or the other murmurs something, a recollection of something Marie said or did, an acknowledgement of how much she'll be missed, a hope that she's at peace now, free from pain and suffering and the burdens of her earthly existence. When they've done all they can do, when Marie's body is wrapped and prepared, Thomas lifts her. She weighs very little, her body having wasted away to almost nothing in her final weeks, and carries her to the small storage shed they use for keeping certain supplies dry and protected, a structure barely large enough to stand up in but adequate for this sad purpose. They place her there gently, respectfully, packing snow around the wrapped form to aid in preservation. And then Thomas closes the door and secures it against scavenging animals. And they stand for a moment in the snow outside the shed. And Marjorie finds herself whispering a prayer, the words of the Ave Maria that she learned as a child, that still live in her memory, even though she is no longer permitted to enter a church, no longer welcome in the religious community that those words represent. Thomas adds his own prayer, words in Latin that she recognizes as part of the burial service, phrases he must have heard countless times at funerals in his previous life, and his voice is steady despite the emotion she knows he's feeling. And when the prayers are finished, they stand a moment longer in silence. And then Marjorie says, "We should gather everyone together, tell them about Marie, give us all a chance to share memories, to grieve together." Thomas agrees, and so they make their way from hut to hut through the snow, knocking gently on each dwelling, speaking quietly to each inhabitant, sharing the news of Marie's passing, watching as shock and sorrow register on each face, as tears flow freely because here there is no shame in crying, no expectation that grief should be hidden or controlled. And gradually they gather everyone in the main hut, squeezing in around the fire, 7 people now instead of 8, a notable absence. A hole in their circle where Marie should be sitting with her cracked smile, and her unexpected humor and her perspective that came from having lived long enough to develop real wisdom. Peter has brought his small drum, a simple instrument he made from a clay pot and stretched leather, and he plays it softly, a slow, rhythmic beat that isn't mournful exactly but is solemn, appropriate, a heartbeat rhythm that grounds them all. And Anne, who has a surprisingly lovely voice, begins to sing, a hymn they all know, and gradually others join in, their voices damaged and rough but sincere. And the sound they make together is not beautiful in any conventional sense, but it is genuine. It is human. It is the sound of people reaching for something beyond their immediate circumstances, reaching for meaning and connection, and perhaps even for God. If God can hear them here, if God pays attention to outcasts and lepers and people who live beyond the boundaries of normal society. They sing several hymns, songs they all remember from their previous lives, from attending Mass in village churches, from feast days and holy days, from baptisms and weddings and yes, from funerals too. And between songs people share memories of Marie, recalling moments of kindness she showed, funny things she said, the way she never complained even when she had every reason to complain, the strength she showed in her final year as her body failed but her spirit remained undimmed. William, who rarely speaks, surprises them all by sharing a long story about a conversation he had with Marie several months back, a night when he was feeling particularly low, particularly hopeless, and Marie had sat with him and talked about acceptance, about how accepting your circumstances doesn't mean giving up or surrendering your dignity, but rather means acknowledging reality so you can figure out how to live within it, how to find whatever joy and meaning and purpose are available, rather than spending all your energy fighting against what cannot be changed. She told me, William says, his voice rough with disuse and emotion, that being diagnosed with leprosy was the worst thing that ever happened to her, but also that in some strange way it had taught her what really mattered, had stripped away all the trivial concerns and social pretensions and revealed the core of things, that kindness matters, that connection matters, that how we treat each other when we're at our most vulnerable, that's what defines us as human beings. He pauses, struggling with his feelings, and then continues. She said she wouldn't wish this life on anyone, but she also wouldn't trade the lessons she'd learned, the clarity she'd gained. And she said that here, in this outcast place with us outcast people, she had found a kind of authenticity, a kind of truth that she never found in her normal life when she was trying to be respectable and proper and concerned with what the neighbors thought. His words hang in the air, profound and unsettling because they suggest that perhaps there is something valuable to be found even in suffering, even in exile, not that the suffering is good or should be sought, but that human beings have this remarkable capacity to find meaning even in the most difficult circumstances, to grow and change and learn even when, perhaps especially when, life strips away everything comfortable and familiar and forces us to confront fundamental questions about who we are and what matters. The group sits in contemplative silence for a while after William speaks, each person presumably thinking about Marie's words, about their own journey toward acceptance or their own continuing struggle against their fate. And then Anne speaks up, her young voice tentative but determined. "I want to say something," she announces, and everyone turns to look at her, giving her their full attention, and she takes a visible breath before continuing. "When I first came here, I wanted to die. I actually wanted to die. Everything I had hoped for, everything I had planned, it was all gone, and I couldn't see any reason to keep living. But Marie, she didn't try to convince me that things weren't that bad, or that I should look on the bright side, or any of that false cheerfulness that would have just made me angry. Instead, she just sat with me and she let me cry, and she said that yes, it was terrible, and yes, I had every right to be angry and sad, but she also said that if I could just hold on, just survive one day at a time, eventually, I might find that there were still reasons to live, still moments worth having, still connections worth making. Anne's voice wavers and tears stream down her cheeks, but she pushes on. She was right. I didn't believe her at first, but she was right. There have been good moments, even here. There have been mornings when the sunrise was beautiful, and evenings when we sat around the fire and talked, and times when someone made me laugh, and times when I was able to help someone else and felt useful and needed. And those moments, they don't erase the bad things, don't make up for what I've lost, but they're real, they count, they're something. She wipes her eyes with her sleeve, and Marjorie reaches over and squeezes her hand, and Anne squeezes back, and there's a moment of connection between them that speaks to the bonds that have formed in this unlikely community. Bonds forged in shared suffering, but sustained by genuine care and affection. The memorial continues like this for quite some time, people sharing stories and memories, some laughing through their tears as they recall Marie's particular brand of humor, her way of making observations that were both funny and wise, her timing in delivering a perfectly chosen comment that would deflate tension or redirect a conversation that was becoming too heated or negative. And gradually, through this process of collective remembering and grieving, they begin to transform their shock and immediate sorrow into something more like peaceful acceptance, an acknowledgement that Marie had lived her life, had faced her challenges with grace and strength, and had died peacefully, which is perhaps as much as anyone can hope for. Eventually, the gathering begins to break up naturally, people returning to their huts to attend to the day's necessities, though not before Peter announces that he will make a marker for Marie's eventual grave, will carve her name and the dates if anyone can remember exactly when she was born and when she came to the colony, and they piece together what information they have, approximating, accepting that the record will be incomplete but determined to create something that will mark her passing. That will say to anyone who might someday see it that Marie lived, that she mattered, that she was remembered. Marjorie, who has been fighting her own illness throughout this entire morning, finally allows herself to acknowledge how terrible she feels, how much worse she's gotten even in the few hours since waking. And when Thomas notices her swaying slightly on her feet, he insists, in a tone that brooks no argument, that she return to her hut immediately and rest. "You can't help anyone if you collapse," he points out reasonably. And Marjorie, who would normally resist being told what to do, is too exhausted and too sick to fight, so she simply nods and allows him to escort her back to the main hut, where John, who has woken from his morning sleep and has already heard about Marie's death, has built up the fire and has heated water and has even, somehow, scrounged up some dried chamomile that he's steeping, preparing it for Marjorie without being asked, showing an attentiveness and care that touches her deeply. Thomas helps Marjorie settle onto her sleeping pallet, arranging blankets around her with a gentleness that belies his damaged hands, and John brings the chamomile tea, still steaming, presenting it to her with an awkward formality that makes her want to smile despite how awful she feels. She accepts the cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around its warmth, inhaling the subtle herbal scent that reminds her of summers long past, of gathering these same flowers in meadows when the world was different and she was different, when her biggest concern might have been whether the dye batch would turn out the right shade of yellow or whether her youngest would finally learn to tie her own shoes. She sips the tea slowly, letting the warmth slide down her raw throat, and she can feel both men watching her with concern that they're trying to mask but not successfully. And she wants to reassure them, wants to tell them she'll be fine, but she's not certain that's true, and she's too tired to lie convincingly. So instead, she simply drinks her tea and tries to conserve what little energy she has left. "You need to sleep," Thomas says firmly, and Marjorie nods, because this is obviously true. She can barely keep her eyes open. But before she surrenders to the exhaustion pulling at her, she needs to make sure that certain things are taken care of, that the community will continue to function even without her directing everything. "Someone needs to check on everyone throughout the day," she manages to say, her voice coming out as barely more than a raspy whisper. "Make sure everyone has enough firewood, enough water." Anne sometimes forgets to eat when she's upset, so someone should bring her something, make sure she takes it. And William, he'll withdraw even more after this. Someone should sit with him even if he doesn't talk, just be present. She's starting to list more tasks, more concerns, but Thomas interrupts her gently. "We'll manage, Marjorie. We've all learned from watching you, from being part of this community. You don't have to carry everything alone, and you especially don't have to carry it when you're sick. Let us take care of things for a while. Let us take care of you." His words strike something deep in her, some place she's kept carefully walled off, and she feels tears spring to her eyes because it has been so long since anyone took care of her, since she was allowed to be vulnerable, to be the one receiving care rather than always providing it. And the relief of being told she can rest, she can let go, someone else will hold things together. It's almost overwhelming. She nods, not trusting herself to speak without breaking down completely, and she lies back on her pallet, pulling the blankets up to her chin, and Thomas moves to adjust the hanging cloth that creates her private alcove, giving her the gift of semi-privacy, of a space where she can let her guard down completely without worrying about being observed. Through the fabric, she can hear him speaking quietly to John, organizing their day, dividing up the tasks that need doing, and she's impressed by how naturally Thomas assumes this leadership role, how he doesn't try to replicate her style, but rather brings his own approach, his own calm steadiness to the work of holding the community together. Sleep claims her quickly, pulling her down into darkness, but it's not restful sleep. It's the fevered, restless sleep of illness, full of confused dreams and uncomfortable half-waking moments where she's not sure what's real and what's imagination. She dreams of her children, dreams that they're calling for her and she can't reach them, separated by some barrier she can't see but can't cross, and she calls back to them but her voice won't work, won't make sound, and the frustration and fear are enormous, choking her, until she startles awake, gasping, her heart racing, her body soaked with sweat despite the cold. She lies there disoriented, trying to remember where she is, why she's here, and then it all comes rushing back. The diagnosis, the separation, the years in the colony, Marie's death, her own illness. and the weight of it all presses down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Or maybe that's just the illness in her lungs, the infection spreading, making each breath a labored effort. She coughs, and the coughing triggers more coughing, a fit that racks her body and leaves her weak and shaking. And she hears movement outside her alcove, hears Thomas's voice asking if she's all right, and she tries to answer but can only cough more. The fabric curtain is pushed aside and Thomas is there, and behind him she can see that it's darker now, evening perhaps, meaning she's slept through most of the day, lost hours to fever and exhaustion. Thomas has a cup of water, and he helps her sit up enough to drink, supporting her back with one arm while holding the cup to her lips with his other hand, and she drinks gratefully, the water soothing her raw throat at least temporarily. "You're burning up," Thomas observes, and she can hear the worry in his voice. The fever's gotten worse. She wants to argue, wants to minimize her condition, but she can feel the truth of what he's saying in the way her skin feels too tight and too hot, in the way her head pounds with each beat of her heart, in the way the simple act of sitting up has exhausted her. "I'll be all right," she whispers, but even to her own ears it sounds unconvincing, sounds like wishful thinking rather than confident assertion, and Thomas makes a non-committal sound that suggests he's not fooled. He tells her that he and John have been managing, that they checked on everyone throughout the day, that Anne is doing as well as can be expected, that Peter and William helped gather additional firewood from the stores they have cached in various protected spots around the clearing, that everyone is settled for the night with adequate supplies. He tells her these things in his calm, methodical way, and she understands that he's trying to reassure her, trying to let her know that she doesn't need to worry, that things are under control, and she's grateful even as part of her struggles with the need to maintain control, the fear that if she lets go completely, if she fully surrenders to the illness and to being cared for rather than being the caretaker, something terrible will happen, though what exactly she fears she can't articulate even to herself. Thomas seems to sense her internal struggle, and he says quietly, "It's all right to be weak sometimes, Marjorie. It's all right to need help. You've given so much to all of us. Let us give something back to you now. Let us show you that we learned from your example, that the community you've built is strong enough to support you when you need it." His words, spoken with such gentle conviction, break through her resistance, and she nods, blinking back tears, and she allows herself to lie back down, allows him to arrange the blankets around her again, allows him to place a cool cloth on her forehead. When did he prepare that, she wonders? How did she not notice? And the coolness against her burning skin is such a relief that she actually sighs aloud. Thomas tells her he's made more of the medicinal tea, the same mixture she had prepared for Marie, and though the irony of this isn't lost on her, she accepts the cup when he brings it, drinks it slowly, tastes the honey and the herbs, and tries not to think about whether this will be enough, whether she will follow Marie into death, or whether her body will find the strength to fight off this infection. She doesn't want to die, not yet, not when there's still so much to do, so many people who need her, but she also knows that want doesn't always matter, that disease and death follow their own logic, indifferent to human desires and plans. The night passes slowly. each hour marked by Thomas or John checking on her, offering water or tea, adding wood to the fire, adjusting her blankets, sitting with her when she wakes confused and disoriented from fever dreams, speaking softly to ground her back in reality, reminding her where she is, that she's not alone, that they're watching over her. At some point, she's lost track of time, can't tell if it's the middle of the night or nearly morning. She wakes to find Anne sitting beside her pallet, the young woman's face illuminated by the glow of the fire beyond the alcove curtain. Anne is holding Marjorie's hand, her own damaged fingers wrapped gently around Marjorie's swollen knuckles, and when she sees that Marjorie is awake and aware, she smiles, a sad, sweet smile that holds both worry and affection. "You've been very sick," Anne says softly. "We've been taking turns sitting with you. Thomas said you shouldn't be alone, that if you woke up scared or confused, someone should be here." Marjorie tries to speak, tries to thank her, but her throat is so raw and swollen that the words won't come, so she squeezes Anne's hand instead. Hopping the gesture conveys what her voice cannot, and Anne squeezes back and continues speaking, her voice low and soothing, telling Marjorie about the day, about how everyone has been helping, how John has revealed unexpected organizational skills, how even William emerged from his shell to help coordinate the wood gathering, how they all came together just as Marjorie taught them to do, supporting each other, taking care of each other. "You built something real here," Anne says, and there are tears in her eyes now. "You built a community, a family almost, and we're not going to let it fall apart. We're not going to let you down. So you need to rest, and you need to get better because we need you, Marjorie. I need you. You're the one who helped me see that life is still worth living, even like this, and I'm not ready to lose you." The raw emotion in Anne's voice, the vulnerability and love, it overwhelms Marjorie, and tears slide down her own fevered cheeks, and Anne reaches over with her free hand to gently wipe them away. And for a while they simply sit like that, holding hands, crying together, sharing grief for Marie and fear for Marjorie and gratitude for whatever time they have. And it's one of those moments that Marjorie knows she'll remember if she survives this. One of those crystalline instances where the veil of ordinary existence seems to thin, and you can see clearly what matters, can feel with absolute certainty the reality of human connection, of love in all its forms, of the way we hold each other up in the darkness. Eventually, Anne begins to sing, very softly, a lullaby that her own mother must have sung to her once, a simple melody with words about stars and sleep and being watched over, and Marjorie lets the sound wash over her, lets it carry her back down into sleep, this time a deeper, calmer sleep than before, as if Anne's presence and voice have anchored her somehow, have given her a reason to hold on, to fight, to come back. When she wakes again, it's to watery daylight filtering through the gaps in the hut's construction, and she realizes with some surprise that she feels different, not well exactly, but not worse either, maybe even slightly better. The crushing pressure on her chest has eased somewhat, and while her throat still hurts and her body still aches, the fever seems to have broken, her skin feeling clammy with cooling sweat rather than burning with dry heat. She tries to sit up and finds she can manage it, though it takes considerable effort and leaves her shaky, and she's attempting to swing her legs off the pallet when Thomas appears, pushing aside the alcove curtain with an expression that shifts from concern to relief when he sees her upright. "You're awake," he says, and there's such obvious gladness in his voice that Marjorie feels another surge of emotion, overwhelmed by how much these people care about her, how much she means to them, how the affection and concern flow both directions in this community they've built together. "I'm awake," she confirms, and her voice is still raspy and weak, but it's working at least, the words forming properly, intelligibly. "How long have I been sick?" Thomas considers this calculating. 3 days since you first fell ill, 2 days since Marie died. You've been fever sick for most of that time, not really conscious except in scattered moments. We've been worried. He states this last part matter-of-factly, not trying to hide the truth, and Marjorie appreciates his honesty, appreciates being treated as someone who can handle reality rather than someone who needs to be protected from it. "I thought I might die," she admits quietly, and Thomas nods slowly. "We thought so too, at least we feared it." "You were very sick, Marjorie. The fever was intense. But you fought and you're still here, and for that we're grateful." She asks about the others, about how everyone is managing, and Thomas assures her that all is well, or as well as can be in their circumstances. No one else has fallen seriously ill, which is a relief, though several people, including himself, have had minor symptoms, some coughing, some congestion, but nothing approaching the severity of what she and Marie experienced. The daily routines have continued, everyone pitching in, learning to work together without her direct oversight. And while Thomas doesn't say it explicitly, Marjorie can hear in his tone a certain pride, a recognition that they've proven themselves capable, that the community she built is sustainable even without her constant management. This should be reassuring, and in many ways it is, but there's also a small, shameful part of her that feels threatened by this information, that wonders if she's as necessary as she thought she was, if perhaps she's been clinging to her role as leader and caretaker, because it gave her purpose and identity in a situation where so much had been stripped away. She pushes this thought aside, recognizing it as unworthy, as the kind of ego-driven concern that doesn't serve anyone, least of all herself. Thomas helps her stand, supporting her when her legs prove weaker than she expected, and together they make their way to the fire where John has prepared a simple breakfast, some porridge made from their grain stores, flavored with a tiny bit of honey and some dried berries that someone must have been saving, a small luxury offered in celebration of her recovery. She sits on the bench and eats slowly, her stomach uncertain after days of consuming nothing but water and tea. But the warm food is welcome, and she manages to finish most of what's in her bowl. As she eats, John and Thomas tell her more about the past few days, about how Peter carved a beautiful memorial marker for Marie, working with painstaking care to create something worthy of her. How Anne has been cooking for everyone, taking over that task with a competence that surprised them all. How William has been maintaining all the fires, making his rounds from hut to hut throughout each day and night to make sure no one's fire dies. How everyone has stepped up, has found ways to contribute. has functioned as a true community. The picture they paint is one of people who have learned well, who have internalized the values and practices that Marjorie worked so hard to establish. And she feels a deep satisfaction hearing this, a sense that perhaps her greatest contribution hasn't been in the specific tasks she's performed, but in creating a culture, a set of expectations and behaviors that can continue even in her absence. This realization is both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it means she's not indispensable. Empowering because it means she's built something that will outlast her, that has taken on a life of its own. As the morning progresses and Marjorie continues to regain strength, people begin to stop by the main hut, drawn by word that she's awake and recovering, each person expressing relief at her improvement, each offering their own form of care. William brings her a smooth stone he found, saying it's good for holding when you need something to focus on. Anne brings an extra blanket she's repaired. Peter brings a small carved bird he made during his vigil by Marie's wrapped body, saying she should have something beautiful to look at while she recuperates. These gifts, simple and heartfelt, touch Marjorie deeply, each one representing not just the object itself but the thought behind it, the care taken, the relationship acknowledged. She realizes that she has been so focused on taking care of everyone else that she hasn't fully recognized how much they want to take care of her as well, how mutual care works best, how allowing yourself to receive is as important as giving, how vulnerability and strength are not opposites, but rather two aspects of the same human capacity for connection and resilience. The day unfolds gently, with Marjorie resting more than she's used to, but also beginning to move around a bit, rebuilding her strength gradually, not pushing too hard but not giving in to weakness either, finding that balance between rest and activity that healing requires. Thomas takes her outside briefly in the afternoon, when the winter sun is at its weak height, helping her walk slowly around the clearing, and the cold air stings her lungs but also feels clean and bracing, waking her up, reminding her that she's alive, that she survived. The snow that fell during the storm has settled and compacted, creating a white landscape that stretches in all directions, beautiful and austere, and somehow peaceful in its emptiness. They walk to the storage shed where Marie's body rests, and Marjorie stands there for a moment in silence, saying her own private goodbye, thanking Marie for her friendship and wisdom, for the example she set, for the conversations they shared, for being present in her life even if that life was circumscribed by disease and exile. "We'll bury her properly in spring," Thomas says quietly, "with words and ceremony and respect. Peter's marker is beautiful, Marjorie. You should see it. He carved her name in a dove and the words she lived with grace. It's perfect." Marjorie nods, imagining this marker, this small monument to a life that the larger world wanted to forget, but that they will remember, that they will honor because they knew Marie not as a leper, but as a person, as someone specific and unique and irreplaceable. As they make their way slowly back to the main hut, Marjorie notices details she hadn't seen before, or perhaps hadn't allowed herself to see. The way John has been organizing the firewood into neat stacks arranged by size, making it easier to find what's needed quickly. The way someone has swept snow away from the entrances to all the huts, creating clear paths. The way Peter has reinforced the door frame on William's hut, which had been gradually coming loose. All these small improvements and maintenance tasks that demonstrate care and attention, that show people investing in their shared space, making it not just a place they're forced to inhabit, but a place they're choosing to maintain and improve within their limited means. This too is part of what community means, she thinks. This willingness to make things better even in small ways, even when the situation is fundamentally difficult. This refusal to give up on dignity and order and beauty just because the world has given up on you. That evening, as the brief winter day fades into darkness and they gather again around the fire, there's a different quality to the atmosphere. Something that has shifted during these days of crisis and grief and pulling together. They talk more easily with each other, the conversation flowing naturally from person to person, everyone contributing, everyone listening, and Marjorie realizes that something important has happened. They've moved from being a collection of individuals living in proximity to being something more integrated, more cohesive, more genuinely a community. The crisis of Marie's death and Marjorie's illness has revealed their strength, has shown them what they're capable of when they work together, has deepened the bonds between them in ways that only shared difficulty can accomplish. Peter brings out his drum again and plays while Anne sings, and this time others join in not just with their voices but with improvised rhythm instruments. John tapping two pieces of wood together, William using a stick against the side of his cup, Thomas clicking two stones. And the music they make is simple but joyful, a celebration of survival, of being alive despite everything, of finding moments of beauty and connection even in the harshest circumstances. As Marjorie sits among them, still weak but recovering, still grieving but also grateful, she thinks about the strange paradox of her situation, how being cast out from society has led her to understand community more deeply than she ever did when she was part of normal village life, how losing everything has taught her what truly matters, how suffering has opened doorways to compassion and understanding that comfort never revealed. She wouldn't choose this life, wouldn't wish it on anyone, but having been forced into it, she has discovered reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, has formed relationships of depth and authenticity that might never have developed in more conventional circumstances, has learned that human dignity and worth don't depend on social status or physical wholeness, but on how we treat each other, how we show up for each other, how we insist on remaining human, even when the world tells us we're something less. The winter night deepens around their small circle of light and warmth, the darkness beyond their fire complete and impenetrable, the cold pressing in from all sides but held at bay, at least for now, by their fire and their shelter and their shared body heat and their determination to survive. Outside, the world sleeps under its blanket of snow, unaware and uncaring about these 7 people living at its margins. But inside this rough hut, life continues, conversation and laughter and planning and remembering, the whole rich tapestry of human existence condensed into this small space, this small community, this small miracle of people refusing to be defeated by circumstances that would defeat anyone who faced them alone. Marjorie feels her exhaustion returning, the weariness that comes after illness pulling at her. But before she retreats to her alcove to sleep, she looks around the circle of faces illuminated by firelight. Thomas with his rapt face and gentle wisdom, John with his youth and growing confidence, Anne with her healing heart and brave voice, Peter with his strong hands and quiet competence, William with his deep thoughtfulness and steady presence. And she feels such love for these people, such gratitude for their existence, such pride in what they've built together. "Thank you," she says simply, and her voice is still rough but clear enough, and everyone looks at her with questions in their eyes, not understanding what she's thanking them for. "For taking care of things while I was sick, for taking care of each other, for being who you are, for making this," and she gestures around the hut, but she means something larger than the physical space. She means the community, the relationships, the shared life they've created, for making this possible, for making it real. There's a moment of silence, and then Thomas speaks for all of them. "You taught us how, Marjorie. You showed us that it was possible to live with dignity, to care for each other, to remain human. We just followed your example." She shakes her head, wanting to protest that it wasn't just her, that they all contributed, but she's too tired to argue. So she simply accepts his words with a nod and a smile. And she makes her way to her sleeping area. And this time, when she lies down and pulls the blankets around herself, she falls into a deep, healing sleep, untroubled by fever dreams or anxiety, her body finally able to rest properly, to put its energy into repair and recovery rather than fighting infection. The days that follow establish a new rhythm, with Marjorie gradually resuming her normal activities, but also learning to delegate more, to share responsibility more evenly, to trust that others can handle tasks she once thought only she could manage. Her illness has forced a shift in the community's structure, making it less dependent on any single person and more genuinely collaborative. And while this wasn't a change she would have chosen to make happen this way, she can see its value, can see how it strengthens the community by distributing knowledge and skills and authority more broadly. John, in particular, has emerged as someone with real leadership potential. His natural organizational abilities combined with a growing confidence making him someone others turn to for guidance and coordination. And Marjorie nurtures this development, consciously mentoring him, teaching him not just the what of community management, but the why, the principles behind the practices, the values that should guide decisions.